It is the biggest problem we face as a planet. It is the reason for climate change and rising greenhouse gas emissions. Pollution is something that can be as simple as littering your garbage, dumping a pollutant into clean water, or even driving your car to work. We as humans are responsible for the killing of our planet, and with climate change starting to become a bigger issue year by year, countries around the world are scrambling to try and become a more green planet before it's too late. For our outsourcing dilemma topic, we will be using China to demonstrate some issues that arose with this topic. The world's top richest countries are ever increasingly outsourcing their carbon emission to China. This outsourcing comes in the form of electronic mass production, cheap clothes, as well as many other goods. Looking at the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, greenhouse gases that warm the planet multiplied twice as quick in the first decade of the 21st century as they did in the previous 30 years. Since the year 2000, annual carbon dioxide emissions from China have nearly doubled to 14 gigatons per year. What does this mean? Factories in China produce more pollution than their equivalent counterparts in the United States, as well as Europe. Part of this issue is due to the lack of CO2 emission limits/standards which would normally be implemented by the government. The outsourcing of those emissions has skewed efforts to account for all global emissions, which typically was conducted on a national basis. Those accounting efforts are no longer accurate, according to analysts. There is now growing debate about how to assign responsibility for emissions generated producing goods that were made in one country but ultimately destined for another. Unless there are deep cuts in emissions up to 70% of current levels by 2050 or a near quadrupling of renewable energy, governments may have to fall back increasingly on experimental technologies for sucking carbon dioxide from the air to avoid dangerous warming. It is a well-known fact that by outsourcing manufacturing to emerging economies like China, developed countries have relocated the consequent carbon emissions and other pollutions to developing countries. For example, according to calculations, 23% of China's emissions were due to net exports in 2004. A 2012 report by an influential committee of British members of Parliament found that even though UK's territorial carbon emissions have been decreasing since 1990, its consumption-based emissions have increased, which means that the UK is contributing to a net increase in global warming. As we live on the same planet and no one can outsource the carbon emissions to the moon, it is obvious that such relocation and outsourcing of pollution is not a solution to challenges like global warming. What goes around comes back around. Relocating production and pollution does not necessarily relieve the Western consumers from the environmental impacts of air pollution. A study analyzed the impact of trade-related Chinese air pollutant emissions and found that in 2006, 36% of anthropogenic sulfur dioxide, 27% of nitrogen oxides, 22% of carbon monoxide, and 17% of black carbon emitted in China were associated with production of goods for export. Combined with atmospheric chemical transport model, an analysis on US air quality shows that Chinese air pollution related to export production contributes, at a maximum on a daily basis, 12 to 24% of sulfate pollution over the western United States. Greenpeace is one of the leading NGOs working on campaigns to reduce sources of air pollution in China. Greenpeace continues to do in-depth investigations and original reportage on the urgent issue of air pollution in China. Coal contributes the bulk of the country's emissions of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. Greenpeace is pushing for China to reduce and eventually end its use of coal. China has abundant potential for clean, zero-emissions energy such as wind and solar. Switching to these energy sources would make a huge difference for air quality. The very iPhone that you may be holding in your hands is one of the very reasons China has the pollution they do. Apple is very smart in this regard. Mass-producing such a product in the United States would prove to be very costly and potentially less efficient due to stringent laws which are in place to protect both the environment and workers' rights. In China, these so-called regulations are clear as mud, so to say, meaning they don't exist. Due to this, Apple can make their product very cheaply. When looking into things, who would be to blame for the emissions produced in making the iPhones, Apple or China? Well, according to pollution reports, it is China. If production were to move to North America, to the end user, the price would increase substantially, and there could be potential production limitations. By utilizing the NGOs such as Greenpeace, we can make a difference by putting pressure on the government to impose more stringent regulations on carbon emissions, as well as pressuring their very own industries into making the switch to more green ways. By shining light onto the many positives of switching to more eco-friendly practices, we can push for a greener future. If you support this cause, we ask if you please go to our website www.greenworldindustry.com and sign our petition, stating that you believe that there should be change in regulations on carbon emissions, and making industries become more eco-friendly.